It's well known that Wang Shangjai and his senior students had a problematic, conflictual even, relationship with the orthodox world of Chinese martial arts. And I've explored in other videos Wang Shangjai's idea that, well, it's not an idea, is it? It's a well-founded observation that all of those things that present themselves as amazing virtues in the orthodox world of Chinese wushu are very often hypocrisy. Or as Wang Shangjai says, they're the opposite. They're the opposite of what they pretend or appear to be. And this isn't about things themselves as such. So it's not about things like lineage or titles or any of the other things that Wang Shangjai and his students criticised. It's about the interpretation of those things, the version of those things that presents itself within the orthodoxy and how it comes to be there. In other words, hypocrisy. And I've spoken before about how Wang Shangjai gives us this incredibly useful model for understanding whether or not we're on the right path, whether or not we're on the right tracks in how we understand or interpret something within Chinese wushu. And it's as simple as look at what the stifling orthodoxy says and does, and you say, think and do the opposite. And this isn't just Wang Shangjai being bloody minded. It's a logical argument about the nature of the truth. The truth, or things that are along the right lines, they just exist as they are. They don't need to define themselves in relationship to anything else. If only one person knows the truth and everyone else says it's a lie, it doesn't matter, the truth is still true. It's the lies that need to define themselves. It's the lies that need to exist in a relationship to the truth. The truth doesn't need to haggle. The truth doesn't need to negotiate. Whereas the lie has to take on the reality of the existence of the truth, and it has to argue against it, and it has to position itself in relationship to it. And look at the genius of what Wang Shangjai is doing here. He's saying that the orthodox world of Chinese wushu has achieved such a level of corruption that this process has ensured that the way ideas, concepts, beliefs, practices are presented and understood have formed themselves in diametric opposition to the truth. So even if you don't know what the truth is, you can just look at what the orthodoxy says and you can extrapolate from that the exact opposite is likely to be the truth. And there's obviously a missing piece of the puzzle here, which is why Wang Shangjai thinks that there's hypocrisy there in the first place. And that comes down very simply to outcomes. And we know that he thought that the outcomes just weren't there, that people weren't achieving high level in Chinese wushu, but nevertheless they were achieving high level in terms of status. And that's the missing piece of the puzzle, and we'll come back to that. All of these ideas I've talked about in other videos, so I don't want to rehearse that information. What I want to do is move the argument on into something useful, something practical, something that can actually help us. And to get there, let's think about a few problems that emerge from Wang Shangjai's thinking. And the first one is that, true or not, once you engage that idea of the orthodoxy being this world of hypocrisy, it's incredibly negative. It's something that if you engage it, if you start arguing against it, if you start talking about it, it's so negative. It's so not what most people want. Most people are looking for positive, proactive ways to improve their level. Engaging in constant bickering or criticism about things that other people are doing just brings everyone down. It brings me down to see it, and I know that it brings other people down when I talk about it. So we have to find the right balance. We have to find the right level of necessary criticism that we have to engage in order to move forward. The three trees of Yiquan exist in a social environment, and if there are toxins in that social environment, then they cannot grow. Individually, we can't grow, and as a social movement, each one can't grow. So there is a certain level of necessary criticism that we have to engage in. Second problem is that Yiquan itself, even while Wang Xiangjai was alive, started to become immersed again within what Wang Xiangjai saw as the problematic orthodoxy of Chinese wushu. So it began to adopt elements of the orthodoxy. You don't have to take my word for this. Wang Xiangjai himself wrote about this. He says that he saw his own students were beginning to codify Yiquan into set numbers of postures, set standing postures, set curriculums of Shili and so on. And he says that that's not what he wanted. It's moving everything back towards that ossified orthodoxy where there are fixed methods. And he knew everything that follows on from there, people bickering about, no, this is the orthodox method, no, this is the orthodox method, you don't know anything, so on and so forth. All of that incredibly toxic stuff that happens in the Yiquan discussion space. And we know that the problem is even more complex because Wang Xiangjai wasn't a great teacher. All of his students say that. So we do need some degree and level of codification. We do need some degree and level of curriculum. It's hard to find the right balance between being continuously revolutionary but holding on to the core elements. And again, Wang Xiangjai himself writes about this. He tells us that you've got to constantly be innovative, but there's a certain core of quintessence movement principles, which if you move beyond those, it's no longer Yiquan. So that in itself is a problem and a difficulty that we have to face. But it's no different in essence to the difficulty faced in any other field, whether it's science or being a musician. There's a social field, there's set curricula, and then there's innovation, and we have to find that right balance. And we should also say there's also necessary critique. So science doesn't just progress by people patting each other on the back. You have to positively engage other people's work, build on it, but also critique it. We find that very hard to do in Chinese wushu. I think we all know that. And then thirdly, there's a phenomenon where being the iconoclastic Wang Xiangjai figure has become a kind of orthodoxy in itself, or we should say more accurately, a cliche. So there's no shortage of these people who will turn up on a forum about Yiquan, Chinese martial arts, Zhanzhuang, write thousands of words about how they're the only person in the world who really understands it, or how only one teacher that they're connected to understood it, and they'll make all kinds of obnoxious quibbles about other people's posture, say everyone else is totally doing it wrong and it's totally pointless, and they'll be, I don't know, they'll talk about how many thousands of hours of standing they've done or how long they do standing for and so on. We know the type. They're right, only them, only the way they do it, and only one person had the true method and that's been passed on to them. Like some kind of apostolic tradition has been passed on. Well, it doesn't take a psychological genius to work out that this is somebody who feels incredibly insecure in their life world. So they go on the internet and they pose. And the key is always that, for one thing, as Wang Xiangjai says, if you ask them to show you, they absolutely never can. But secondly, it's always vanity quibbling about method. And vanity quibbling is where people say, oh, your knees should be bent this much, or your arms are in the wrong place, your arms should be more rounded, and so on. It's vanity quibbling about method. It's never ever about outcome, because if it was about outcome, then they'd have to show you something. And I also see it as a kind of micro-fascism where they want to go online and they want to abuse others. They want to find some excuse for abusing others, and vanity quibbling is one of the ways that they do that. Just going online and being incredibly obnoxious to other people. And although those people exist in large numbers, enough for there to always be one at least on a discussion forum, the overall problem runs through the majority of the Yiquan discussion space. This idea of vanity quibbling, criticising others to promote yourself rather than to promote a deeper understanding of Chinese martial arts. I saw one the other day where a young woman had posted a photograph of herself doing standing, and it was a great photograph. The background's like some kind of Chinese arch. She's wearing a fabulous outfit. It's a really great, well-presented, well-posed photograph. And within a day, three obnoxious men had commented, one telling her to smile, one criticising her outfit, and one of these people that I'm talking about who suffers from some kind of mental trouble has written 1,000 words criticising her posture. And I just thought, well, this just sums it up, doesn't it? This just sums up the degradation of the Yiquan discussion space, and it's absolutely not what Wang Xiangjai wanted. Unfortunately, to resist the toxins, to repel the toxins in some way, sometimes we have to engage and be honest and discuss and recognise this stuff. Anyway, what I wanted to do, what I'm going to do, is break off a part of this overall trouble with the orthodoxy and discuss how Wang Xiangjai transforms it into a really positive, useful thing. And the thing is Wude. Wude, martial ethics, martial virtue. And I've spoken elsewhere about how Wang Xiangjai and his students had a really difficult relationship with this idea, like they do with all the ideas that are presented as virtues within the orthodoxy. And I've also talked about how Wang Xiangjai's student Zhao Daoxin wrote quite a bit about this, about the hypocrisy of the idea of Wude, how it's used to repress and control necessary critique and therefore innovation, which is, putting it mildly, Zhao Daoxin makes a much stronger argument than that, but I've talked about that elsewhere. And remember, with all of these ideas, it's not about saying that these core concepts within Wushu are in themselves wrong. The idea is that they've somehow been hijacked. I mean, that's the essence of hypocrisy, isn't it? They've been hijacked by, not everyone, but as an overall orthodoxy, they've been hijacked and their meanings have been reversed. So they're always dialectical, and there's always a good version and an evil version. And the idea of each one, in essence, is to be the good school, to use the good interpretations. That's why, for example, it's so wrong when we find these people who are on the internet trolling others with vanity quibbling and so on. It's not what you do in the vision of the good school. And all of this ties together because the problem that Wang Xiangjai has is how to promote something that's radically creative, but at the same time holds on to core quintessence principles, or even on a more basic level has some kind of coherence. That is, that there is something called ichan, but nevertheless it's creative, it's radical, it can change, it can innovate, it can adapt, it can move with the times. I was reading a Taiji Chuan manual by Wu Zhiqing, published in 1943, I think, where he says, because Taiji has become so popular, it's also become watered down, and that's the same problem. And he's addressing this idea and saying, how do you deal with that? And Wang Xiangjai also had to address this problem. And this exists as a general problem, but it also exists in every particular case of every item of Chinese Wushu that's valuable. How do you differentiate between the counterfeit and the good school version? In the specific case of Wude, how do we interpret appropriate behaviour? What's the line between being rebellious and being obnoxious, for example? Or are there other ways to think about and interpret Wude? And what Wang Xiangjai does here, to me, is something absolutely astonishing. We can see it as a moment of genius, or we can see it as Wang Xiangjai's genius of being able to see the truth, of being able to cut through the BS and see what is the actual true meaning. And this is that behaving appropriately is also good sports science. Behaving appropriately leads to better outcomes. And that's why there's such a strong link between the inappropriate behaviour of the hypocritical and corrupt orthodoxy and their total lack of any realistic outcomes. They are, in that beautiful Scottish phrase, two cheeks of the same arse. And I want to be clear that I've fallen deeply below that standard in my own personal behaviour multiple times. And worse than that, I've blamed other people for my behaviour, which is horrible. And I don't do this thing where I've got a convenient excuse that I was always on a journey, I was learning, I was evolving, I've become educated. It's not up to me to forgive myself for things that I've done. But I like to think that most people would say, the outcome they want is that people are able to reflect on their own behaviour and improve, at least try and improve, at least understand the need for improvement. And they do. And one of the most important tools that helped me understand that is the way that the old Yiquan masters re-understood the concept of Wu-De. Remember that Wang Shangjai said that Yiquan is about re-understanding yourself. Well, that idea of re-understanding is profound. It's like so many of Wang Shangjai and his students' ideas, the pebble in the pond that just keeps expanding into ever bigger ripples. Re-understanding not just yourself, but re-understanding concepts, just like later on we re-understand movement, we re-understand martial arts techniques, and we re-understand each one itself. So let me ask you something. As Chinese martial arts practitioners, most of us have seen these ideas like Wu-De used, deployed in discussion hundreds of times. But have you ever, even once, seen the idea of Wu-De used in a way that wasn't to put down or criticise someone else? And then, most usually, it's used to put down criticism. It's used to control criticism. It's a point that Zhao Daoxin himself makes. It's used to repress people who want to be critical of others, to say it's poor Wu-De. And then there will usually be something, because it's a cliche, it's a cliched argument that structures itself in relationship to the truth. So as part of the cliche, there will always be something else that says something like, true martial arts practitioners just get on with practice. Whereas in Yiquan, critique, necessary critique, not vicious, pointless, psychologically damaged critique, but necessary, scientific, if you like, critique, is a vitally important part of practice. But I'll come back to that in a minute. The first stage of Wu-De, Yiquan's version of Wu-De, the way it was reimagined by Wang Shangjai and his students, is to be seen as honesty in your own practice. So nothing to do with what other people are doing at first, everything to do with looking at your own training, looking at your own practice. Just like I've said multiple times, no one needs to be thinking about, well, if I want to do each one, then I have to be prepared to go into the UFC or something like that. Just being honest about your own goals, the amount and level of practice that you're prepared to put in towards achieving those goals. And also on a more technical level, as Yao Zhongzun, amongst others of Wang Shangjai's students, tell us, having the overall idea of the reality of the context of the fight as your guiding star. So this all links in to the idea that Wang Shangjai draws from Buddhism, of pursuing what's real, of being honest about what it is that you're pursuing, and is it the reality of martial arts or is it something else? So fundamentally being honest, and all that other stuff that I've talked about in the videos in the intermediate series that I began with. So for example, those vulnerable adults who go onto the internet and they write reams of vanity, quibbling, insulting stuff about others, if the internet breaks down, then their whole illusion of self is gone. They're just left with the reality of who they are, and that's very damaging for them. The internet and that kind of micro-fascist behaviour that they engage in is a kind of self-medication. So most of us aren't at that stage. If that was taken away from those people, they would have nothing else and they would need a medical intervention to get better. Most of us aren't there. We've all got our problems, but for the rest of us, it's a much more mundane idea around just being straightforwardly honest about our achievements, what we're prepared to put into achieving more, and our actual level. And that's incredibly difficult to do, I think. We only have to look at some of the discussions in the Chinese martial arts discussion space, and honestly, I don't know if you're like me, but I read stuff and I think, do these people have any conception of the level and degree of violence that they would face if they ever had to actually put the gloves on, even, never mind a real fight, just put the gloves on with anyone who is even just low amateur level at fighting or sparring? They have no conception. So being honest is one of the most difficult aspects of all in Wude, but it's also one of the most useful in terms of sports science, and no athlete can really progress without that. And then remember that Yiquan itself exists dialectically as both an individual and a social process. It's an individual journey and a social project. And Wang Shangjai and his students give us lots of examples of things where doing the right thing, being the good school, leads ultimately to better outcomes, better practical, real outcomes. So, for example, Wang Shangjai talks about, he doesn't tell people that they can't use the title master. What he says is that he doesn't. He leads by example, and he says it's forbidden for people to call him master. And he expands on this into the whole master-disciple relationship, which he despised. He didn't want it to be a part of Yiquan, not just for the sake of iconoclasm, but because it's bad sports science. And he makes this explicitly clear. He talks about teachers and students having this barrier that's put in place where the teacher is just the font of all knowledge and the student can't say anything back. And Wang Shangjai says they can't really get down and discuss the brass tacks of martial arts practice. It's really bad coaching practice. And of course it needn't be, but that's the point. If you stick to what Wang Shangjai sees as this slave master system of the traditional discipleship process, then it does form a barrier. You can't question it. But if you evolve the relationship, Wang Shangjai himself says, the name is gone, but the thing that was of value remains. So you lose titles like Shifu and Master, and let's be honest, people who are feeling a little bit inferior in this overwhelming world really cling on to those things. But if you get rid of those things and you get rid of this formal master-disciple relationship in the way that it was structured in China at the time, then you can create something new. It's the same thing, but it's the element of the thing that was of value, the thing that was important, that remains. The thing that was a barrier to progress is gone. You no longer have to just accept what your teacher says. You can be interactive. You can learn from other sources. You can go to other schools. You can learn from other people. You can broaden your horizons. You can question. Zhao Daoxin expands upon this in multiple different ways. He talks about people who go through the Baishi ceremony and then they find themselves shackled to their master. And if it turns out their master isn't very good, there's nothing they can do about it. They've sworn an oath and they're stuck. And he says, well, just forget about all of that. It's nonsense. Just go somewhere else. But he also says that whole old system way of doing things creates these ossified bureaucracies in the first place, and they repress innovation, they crush mavericks, they destroy the mental health of people who just want to improve things. And then let's look at other things that Wang Shangjai talks about. So this idea of people who claim high level from behind closed doors. It's not just about criticising people for being braggarts. It's recognising that this is incredibly bad for each one as a social project. Once you go down that line, then you can have people writing these 1,000-word essays on the internet, putting down everyone else. And when they're asked to demonstrate, like Wang Shangjai says, let's see. Wang Shangjai says, you can't just talk about it forever. Well, these people are giving him a run for his money because they can. In science, you've got to publish your results, put them out there. They've got to be open to critique. It's essential for growth as a social project. Or it doesn't need to be science. It could be anything. It could be guitar playing. Someone could be writing, and I'm sure they certainly are, writing on the internet about how they're the greatest guitar player ever, etc. They've developed all these amazing new techniques. They're the only ones who know how to play guitar. Someone says, okay, then let's see. And they say, I don't have to show you anything, you're not worthy, etc. As a social movement, nothing can move forwards like that. So it's not just bad behaviour, it's very poor sports science. Let's consider something else Wang Shangjai talks about, which is ridiculous customs from the past, carrying on prejudice, as he says, ridiculous prejudices from the past. How forward-thinking is that? Ridiculous prejudices about who can be taught what. At one time, women couldn't be taught Zhanzhuang, for example. Ridiculous prejudices that we could now expand into multiple different areas, but how prescient and forward-thinking. It's not just bad behaviour, it's not just ignorance and prejudice, it's incredibly bad sports science. Why would you keep talents out of any field? We need those talents. What about reliance on the reputations of other people? So this is something that happens all the time. It's not just incredibly bad behaviour, it's incredibly bad sports science. But it's the perfect example of how something presents itself as a virtue within the orthodoxy, but is incredibly negative and draws everyone backwards. In science, you couldn't say, oh, but I was a student of Einstein, and then everything you say just has to be true. It might give you a certain credibility when you're talking about Einstein, but it doesn't say anything about your own level as a physicist, as a mathematician, and the work that you're producing. Relying on the reputations of other men, other people, to promote yourself is absolutely vile. Yet it presents itself as the most astonishing of all virtues. In fact, the be-all and end-all of all virtues. That's the true mirror world in action. It's incredibly bad for each one as a social project. It can only drag us backwards. And I've told this story before about how my coach humiliated some obnoxious so-and-so who was bragging about who their teacher was. And my coach said, well, why would I care? Why would I care who his teacher was? The only thing that matters is his actual level. And my coach then revealed what this person's actual level was. But what does that say about me? It doesn't mean that I could do that. It doesn't mean that I have that level. In fact, I saw a level of each one then that I've still never seen since. And if I can't do it, then by definition, I don't understand it. So I can't teach it. So what does it matter who my teacher was when it comes to something like that? More importantly, what really matters is to learn from nature, to learn intuitively from nature. As the great Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi used to say, I mostly train in nature, so you can say that nature is my teacher. And that's very much true for Miyamoto Musashi. He learned a little bit from his dad, but he mostly just trained on his own, following intuition. Literally no one argues about whether he was the real deal or not. And another good example, by the way, that I've talked about before, that Zhao Daozhen gives, is how challenge fights and challenge fighting is presented as the ultimate macho example of true warriorship or some BS like that. And Zhao Daozhen had a lot of challenge fights himself, but later in his life he reflected on this and said, well, actually it's incredibly poor sports science. So much information is lost through that process. So much information just disappears because someone is humiliated. Whereas if it's about sport, if there's a sporting element, a sport competition approach, then people can win, people can lose, people can adapt, and the whole thing as a social movement can move forward. Whereas in reality, most of the people who talk about challenge fights and all that bullshit, well, they would never do that, and they never have done that. I've had 4, and 3 of them didn't even come to a fight because the other person started crying. That's how macho and heroic that it was. I've talked about all of that stuff elsewhere, so let's think about one other thing. I think it's very important, and this is the behaviour of people within the ichan discussion space, which is just consistently appalling, obnoxious, insulting. I'm not talking about people standing up for themselves. I do that myself. If people want to be a bully, then, well, we don't want people in each one to be wet lettuces. We don't want people to be pushovers. People in each one, if you're going to be serious, you've got to be rough and you've got to be tough and you've got to be up for it. We know that. It's about fighting at the end of the day. So we don't want people to be doormats, but we also don't want people to be, well, I'm saying we, it's not for me to tell everyone. That's not what it's about. And this is the whole point of this video. It's incredibly bad sports science, either to be boorish or to be a wet lettuce. You have to work on and find courage and confidence, but you also have to understand what Wuda means in terms of our behaviour towards others and promoting each one as a social project. People being obnoxious and rude and falling into all of that vanity quibbling and bickering between schools, which Wang Shangjai specifically said was appalling behaviour. But there's other things as well. So I saw recently someone had posted various Yiquan clips on a Facebook site, and they must have gone fairly public. So lots of people had responded who probably otherwise wouldn't have been interested in each one. And they criticism was overwhelming, incredibly negative, and to me it wasn't vanity quibbling, it wasn't micro-fascism, it was just people saying, I think this is bullshit and here's why. And to me, that's straightforward, honest, necessary critique. And the person who posted them just responded by calling them all stupid and saying they were ignorant. And to me, that's not an appropriate response, and that's not what we mean by Wu De in Yiquan. And this is someone who spent a lifetime behaving like this. And I remember seeing maybe 20 years ago a post of his coach sparring, and someone had put a comment saying, why is it that no one ever dares to hit your coach back? Which is basically what the video was. Someone just hitting someone else and the students just giving in. And this person said, well, this coach, she projects a aura that prevents people from hitting him back, which is just such obnoxious bullshit. How does that help promote Yiquan? How does calling people stupid and saying that they're ignorant when they're just presenting robust but nevertheless necessary, honest, straightforward critique? How does insulting them, calling them stupid, saying they're ignorant promote Yiquan? All it does is make Yiquan ever more insular, ever more draw up the drawbridge. Let's stay behind our walls, stay behind closed doors. Anyone who thinks that what we're doing isn't great, well, they're just stupid. Well, how does that broaden horizons? How is that not being a frog in a well? It's incredibly bad sports science. So that's what I wanted to get across today, and it's been difficult. I've been thinking a lot about how to phrase this. I don't want to drag everyone down with me talking negatively about every stupid thing that I see someone post, but I do want to, in some way, help pass on this inoculation against the toxicity that poisons the three trees of Yiquan. This inoculation that was developed by Wang Shengjai and his students in the way that they understood Wu De, which includes honesty in your own behaviour, making Wu De more than anything focused about you, not about what's wrong with other people, but then extending that into re-understanding all those old concepts within Chinese martial arts, like lineage, like Wu De itself, like even concepts like forms, like qi, like everything that's part of Chinese wushu, and recognising this idea that, well, these have been perverted in the orthodoxy and within the orthodoxy of each one as well, reclaiming that and seeing Wu De along those lines of, yes, it's rebellious, yes, it's iconoclastic, but there's an inherent logic to it. And that inherent logic is that everything knits together ultimately to create better outcomes. Because I tell you what, I don't see Yiquan or Chinese martial arts as museum pieces.